Welcome back, everybody. Get ready because today we are diving into something special. Um, the Phoenix Suns and their 7 seconds or less era.
A team that just changed the NBA, really.
And, I got to give a huge shout out to all our listeners. You guys sent in a ton of research articles, stories. I mean, we've got so much juicy stuff on this. And,
Yeah, it's crazy how much there is out there.
yeah, it's a team that dominated in the regular season with this style that nobody had seen before, but they just couldn't get over the hump and win a championship.
Yeah.
So the big question is, what made them so special and what held them back?
It really is a fascinating story. A coach who wanted shots up within 7 seconds, a point guard who was like a magician with the ball, and a team that just played at a speed the league had never seen.
Yeah, so before we get into all the 7 seconds or less craziness, can you kind of set the scene for us? What was the NBA like back in the early 2000s?
Okay, so think slower, much more physical. A game that really revolved around big men in the paint, it's a different era. But even then, the Suns, with players like Jason Kidd and Shawn Marion, even back then, they were showing signs of wanting to push the pace. Like in the 2001 season, they averaged 93.1 possessions per game,
Whoa.
which was sixth in the league.
Wow, that's pretty fast.
And that might not sound crazy today, but back then that was a really fast pace.
Okay, so they're playing fast, but were they winning?
Not quite. Their offensive rating, which is points scored per 100 possessions, was only 100.3, ranking them 22nd in the league. So they were playing fast, but they hadn't figured out how to turn that speed into efficient offense.
So they had the speed, but not necessarily the system yet, right?
Yeah,
This is where Steve Nash and Mike D'Antoni come in.
exactly. The arrival of Nash in 2004 and D'Antoni taking over as head coach, that was a pivotal moment. They brought with them this philosophy of 7 seconds or less, an offense built on pushing the ball, taking quick shots, and just overwhelming opponents.
And this wasn't just some gimmick, it really worked.
Oh, yeah, it worked incredibly well. Like
Yep.
right away in the 2004-05 season, they tied a franchise record for wins. D'Antoni wins Coach of the Year. Nash wins his first MVP.
Wow.
Even the Dallas Mavericks, where Nash had come from, they later admitted that his departure was a huge blow. It's clear this wasn't just playing fast. It was about playing smart and efficient.
Now, we've all heard so much about Nash's brilliance, but this wasn't a one-man show, right? Who were some of the other key players that made the system work?
You're absolutely right. It was a perfect storm of talent. You had Amar'e Stoudemire, this absolute force in the paint. His athleticism and ability to finish at the rim made him just the ideal pick-and-roll partner for Nash. And then you had Shawn Marion. They called him the Matrix.
The Matrix. Now, that's got to be interesting. What made Marion so special?
Marion was this incredible blend of athleticism, versatility, and he just had a knack for making things happen. He could rebound, defend multiple positions, score without needing plays, run for him.
Wow.
He thrived in this chaotic kind of fast-paced offense. Think about it. Most offenses need structure set plays, but Marion Henry was almost better when things were unpredictable.
Wow. So you have this perfectly crafted system, and then you have this wild card who could disrupt things in a good way.
Exactly. And let's not forget the supporting cast. Leandro Barbosa brought instant offense off the bench. Raja Bell was a lockdown defender and a reliable three-point shooter. And later on, they added Jason Richardson, another explosive scorer. They had all the pieces.
All right. So you have the speed, the talent, a system that's built for pushing the pace.
Yeah.
But how do they actually break down opponents? What were the nuts and bolts of this 7 seconds or less offense?
Well, at its core, it was about relentless pressure. The pick and roll between Nash and Stoudemire, that was their bread and butter. But it wasn't just a simple pick and roll. They had so many variations, depending on how the defense reacted. Nash was a master at reading the defense and making the right decision in a split second, whether it was finding Stoudemire rolling to the basket, kicking it out to an open shooter, or taking the shot himself.
So they weren't just running and gunning. There was some serious strategy going on here. What about three-pointers? How big a part of their game was that?
Three-point shooting was absolutely crucial to their success. Guys like Bell and Richardson, they stretched the floor, forcing defenses to spread out, which opened up driving lanes for Nash and Stoudemire. They understood that spacing was key.
It sounds like they were almost ahead of their time in terms of how they used the three-point line. But what about after a missed shot? Did they just give up on the fast break?
Absolutely not. They were committed to pushing the pace no matter what. Whether they made or missed a shot, they were already sprinting down the court, trying to catch the defense off guard. It was like this constant wave of attack, and it was exhausting for opponents to deal with.
Okay, now let's get specific. I keep hearing about this horns formation. What was that all about?
The horns formation, that was one of their go-to sets, particularly when they needed to slow things down a bit.
Hmm.
So, imagine two players, usually Nash and Stoudemire, setting up at the elbows like the horns of a bull.
Oh, okay.
And this created this dilemma for the defense. If they double-teamed either player, it left someone else open. It was
Yeah.
another way for them to create mismatches.
So they had the speed, the shooting, the pick and roll, and even specific formations like the horns to keep defenses guessing.
Mm.
It's just amazing how they blended all these elements together.
It really was a masterpiece of offensive innovation, but what's interesting is that even with all this offensive firepower, they still faced challenges, especially in the playoffs.
Yeah, it almost boggles the mind how they put up those numbers. But here's the thing. Even with all that regular season success, they never won a championship.
Mm.
So what was it about the playoffs that tripped them up?
It's a question that still gets debated among basketball fans. See, while their high-octane offense was amazing in the regular season, it seemed to hit a wall in the playoffs, where the game slows down, defenses tighten up, and every possession becomes a battle.
So are you saying their style just wasn't built for playoff basketball? I mean, they were one of the best teams in the league year after year.
Well, it's not that their style was inherently flawed. There were certain factors that worked against them. For one, they often ran into teams that were built to counter their strengths, like the San Antonio Spurs, known for their defense-first approach.
Oh, the Spurs. They were like kryptonite to the Suns. High-flying offense.
Exactly. The Spurs, with their discipline, and Greg Popovich, the defensive mastermind, they were masters at slowing the game down, forcing the Suns out of their rhythm and making them play a half-court game, which wasn't their forte. It was this clash of styles, and more often than not, the Spurs' defensive wall proved too tough to break through.
So it sounds like a matchup problem. But was it more than just the Spurs?
You're right, there were other things too. Injuries, for one, they played a huge role. A few times key players went down at really bad times, and that derailed their championship hopes.
Oh, man. I can only imagine how frustrating that must have been for them. You build this incredible system, this amazing chemistry, and then it all falls apart because of injuries. So bad luck was part of their story.
I'd say so. It's hard to ignore the impact of those injuries. And then there were some really controversial calls and suspensions in some key playoff series that really swung the momentum against them.
Ugh, don't even get me started on those calls.
Yeah.
I remember watching those games, and it felt like they were battling the refs as much as their opponents.
Right. It definitely added another layer of complexity to those playoff runs. And speaking of complexity, there's one season that really stands out, the 2009-10 season. It was a year of really high highs and really low lows, defying expectations and ultimately falling short.
What happened that year? Remind me.
Well, they actually managed to sweep the Spurs in the playoffs,
Whoa.
which, considering their history with San Antonio, was a huge accomplishment. It felt like they had finally slayed the dragon, like maybe this was their year.
I bet it felt like this massive weight had been lifted off their shoulders. But they didn't win it all that year, did they?
No, unfortunately, their run ended in the conference finals against the LA Lakers, and it was a tough series, but the Lakers, with Kobe Bryant at his peak, just proved too much to handle.
The Lakers were another team that always seemed to give them trouble.
Yeah, they were a tough matchup. They had the size and the star power to match the Suns' speed, and in the end, the Lakers came out on top.
It makes you wonder, with all these playoff struggles, was it even possible for a team built around speed and offense to win it all in a league where the playoffs just become such a grind?
It's a really good question, and there's no easy answer. The Suns' story kind of suggests that their style was awesome for the regular season, but maybe not as well suited for the playoffs.
But wouldn't you say they were ahead of their time? I mean, the league is all about pace and space now, with threes going up everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what makes their story so interesting. Even though they didn't win a title, they changed the way the game is played. They were pioneers of this pace and space era, and we're still feeling their impact today.
So they didn't just win games, they changed the game. What were some of the ways they impacted the league?
Well, their 7 seconds or less offense is widely credited with, making pace and space popular, which is now a fundamental principle of basketball. They focus on quick ball movement, early offense, and spacing the floor with shooters, things that are common now.
And to think how revolutionary that was back then. What else?
They challenged how people thought about building a team. They showed you can win with a smaller, more athletic lineup. I mean, Shawn Marion at power forward, that was crazy back then. It opened the door for teams to value versatility and skill over just size.
Yeah, the days of the big, slow center are over, and that shift, you could really trace that back to teams like the Suns.
Exactly. And we can't forget their role in making the three-pointer popular. I mean, they weren't the first to shoot threes, but they were one of the first to really embrace it as a core part of their offense.
It's crazy how much the game has changed, and the Suns were right there leading the way.
Yeah, they were. And it wasn't just their style of play, it was their attitude. They were fearless, innovative, and they challenged the status quo. They showed everyone there's a different way to play basketball, a more exciting way.
Like the rebels who shook things up and changed the game forever. But you know what? We can't talk about the Suns without talking about their rivalries. They had some amazing battles with some of the other powerhouses of the 2000s.
Oh, yeah. Those rivalries were legendary. They went head-to-head with some of the greatest of all time, and it was always something special.
All right, so let's break down those rivalries. Okay, so rivalries. I mean, who doesn't love a good rivalry, right? And the Suns, they had their fair share of epic battles with some of the NBA's best. Where do we even begin?
Well, you got to start with the Lakers. The early 2000s Lakers with Shaq and Kobe, that was must-see TV every time they faced off.
Oh, man, those were the days. Two totally different styles going at it. The Lakers with their size and power, the Suns with their speed and finesse. Who usually came out on top in those matchups?
It was back and forth, some incredible games. You know, the Lakers obviously had that championship pedigree, but the Suns, they weren't afraid to go toe-to-toe with them.
Those games were always so intense. It felt like the entire league was watching. What about the Spurs? We talked about them a little bit earlier.
Ah, the Spurs. The Suns' ultimate nemesis, you could say. It was like the unstoppable force meeting the immovable object. The Suns wanted to run and gun. The Spurs wanted to grind it out. It was a fascinating clash of style.
And the Spurs usually found a way to shut them down, right?
Yeah, more often than not.
Mm-hmm.
Popovich, he was a master at game planning. He always seemed to find a way to slow Nash down, disrupt their flow, and make them play a style that just didn't suit them.
So it's like they had the Suns' number no matter what.
Yeah, it was a tough matchup for them, that's for sure. But, you know, even in those losses, you could see the Suns pushing the league in a different direction. They were forcing teams to adapt to their style.
And that brings us to the Mavericks. It's almost like a what-if scenario, right? Nash leaving Dallas and going to Phoenix, both teams building these high-powered offenses. It's like a sliding doors moment for the NBA.
It really is. Imagine if Nash had stayed in Dallas. Would they have won a championship together? Would the Mavericks have adopted the 7 seconds or less style?
It's fun to think about. So I guess the big question is, what made the Suns so successful, even if they didn't win a championship? What can we learn from them?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. They had the right players, the right system, and the right mindset. They were committed to playing fast, taking risks, and pushing the boundaries of what was possible.
And they had fun doing it, right? I mean, you watch those games and you can see the joy they played with.
Oh, absolutely. They were infectious. They made basketball fun to watch. But they also understood the importance of strategy and execution. They weren't just running around like chickens with their heads cut off.
So it wasn't just about speed. It was about using that speed intelligently.
Exactly. It was about creating chaos, but also controlling that chaos.
I think that's a great lesson for anyone, not just in basketball, but in life. Sometimes you got to shake things up, take some risks, and trust your instincts.
And surround yourself with talented people who buy into your vision.
That's a key ingredient right there. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the Suns, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember about this team?
I think it's that their impact went far beyond wins and losses. They didn't win a championship, but they changed the way the game is played. They were pioneers, innovators, and they left an indelible mark on the NBA.
Well said. The Phoenix Suns of the 2000s, a team that redefined what's possible and showed the world that basketball can be beautiful. Thanks for joining us on this journey, folks, and keep that love of the game burning bright.